The wind that swept through the desolate streets of Harmony Creek was as cold and sharp as the whispers that followed Clara wherever she went. At 23, she was a study in starkness, a silhouette against the vibrant tapestry of the frontier town. Her face, a canvas of sun-kissed freckles and sharp angles, lacked the soft allure of the other women. Her hair, a practical braid, was the color of dried corn husks. The townsfolk, a chorus of judgmental eyes, had long ago branded her with the cruelest of titles, the plain bride. She was a bride in name only, married off by a desperate father to a man she barely knew, a respectable rancher named Thomas Sterling. Their arrangement was a transaction, a pact of convenience. Thomas, a man of few words and sturdy resolve, needed a wife to manage his sprawling ranch and look after his aging mother. Clara, burdened by a family's financial ruin, was the willing sacrifice. Their wedding was a somber affair, devoid of the usual gaiety, held in the town's small, dust-choked chapel. The only decorations were the pitying glances of the few who attended. On a blisteringly hot afternoon, Clara was a solitary figure in the general store, her basket filled with flour, salt, and beans. The storekeeper, a portly man with a perpetually sarcastic smirk, watched her from behind the counter. "Heard Thomas is heading out to the north pastures soon," he said, his voice a low sneer, "leaving his little bride all alone." Clara ignored him, counting out the coins. She had learned long ago that words were a weapon best left unreturned. Her silence was her shield, but silence couldn't stop the whispers. Two women, their bonnets pulled low, giggled into their hands as they pointed in her direction. "Poor Thomas," one of them murmured, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Stuck with a wife who looks more like a hired hand than a lady." The sting of their words was a familiar ache. She was used to it. She walked out of the store, her head held high, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. The dust, kicked up by the wind, seemed to mock her, swirling around her ankles like a taunting ghost. The ranch, her new home, was a 5-mile ride from town, a lonely bastion of solitude. It was where she felt the most herself, away from the prying eyes of Harmony Creek. Thomas was waiting for her when she arrived, his tall frame leaning against the porch railing. He was a man built for the land, strong shoulders, a weathered face, and eyes that held the quiet wisdom of a man who spent more time with horses than with people. He took the basket from her, his touch brief but respectful. "Town was all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Clara simply nodded. Thomas didn't pry. He understood the unspoken language of the frontier, the things you didn't talk about, the battles you fought alone. They had a strange, comfortable rhythm, a silence filled with mutual understanding. Clara managed the household with an efficiency that surprised him, and he, in turn, treated her with a quiet dignity she hadn't known she was missing. Their relationship was not one of passion, but of respect, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of necessity. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Thomas told her about his plans. "I'll be gone for 3, maybe 4 days," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "The cattle are restless. Need to check the northern fence line. Mother will be with you." His mother, a frail woman named Eleanor, was a different kind of challenge. Eleanor, once a celebrated beauty, looked at Clara with a kind of resigned pity. She was a ghost of her former self, a woman whose memories were tangled in the mists of a fading mind. She lived in her own world, a world where her handsome son was still a boy and his new wife was a stranger. "The girl is so quiet," Eleanor had said to Thomas a few days earlier, her voice a brittle whisper. "Not like the ladies in town. I fear she won't be much company for you." Thomas had simply shaken his head. "She's good for the ranch, Mother. That's what matters." Clara overheard the conversation, the words a familiar blow. She was good for the ranch. It was a utilitarian compliment, a confirmation of her place. She wasn't a wife, not in the way the town understood it. She was a necessity, a practical solution to a practical problem. As Thomas rode away the next morning, a solitary figure against the dawn, Clara felt a familiar pang of loneliness. She was alone again, left with the heavy silence of the ranch and the detached presence of her mother-in-law. The sun climbed high, a relentless orb in a cloudless sky. The heat was oppressive, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the land. Clara worked tirelessly, her hands calloused and strong, mending a torn fence, tending to the chickens, and preparing a simple stew for Eleanor. Suddenly, a storm of dust rose on the horizon. It wasn't the wind, it was a commotion, a growing thunder of hooves. Clara squinted, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As the figures drew closer, a cold dread crept into her veins. They were riders, not a few, but a gang. Their faces were obscured by bandanas, their demeanor radiating a sinister predatory energy. This was not a friendly visit. This was a raid. Panic flared within her, but it was a fleeting emotion, quickly replaced by a steely resolve. Thomas was gone. Eleanor was inside, frail and unaware. She was the only one who could protect them. With a determination that surprised even herself, Clara moved. She bolted for the house, her thoughts a jumble of survival instincts. She was the plain bride, the one mocked and pitied, but she would not be a victim. Not today. The air thickened with the dust and the scent of danger. Clara burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind her and locking the heavy bolt. "Mother!" she cried, her voice strained. "Eleanor, get away from the windows!" Eleanor, startled from her reverie, looked at her with wide, confused eyes. "What is it, dear?" she asked, her voice thin and reedy. "Bandits," Clara said, the word a whisper of dread. "They're here." The gang of 7 men dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel. They were a motley crew, hardened by a life of crime, their guns glinting menacingly in the sun. The leader, a man with a cruel scar that bisected his right eyebrow, gestured for 2 of his men to break down the door. Clara, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, knew a locked door was no defense against men like these. She had to act. She looked around frantically, her gaze landing on Thomas's rifle, propped in a corner by the fireplace. It was a heavy, well-maintained firearm, a tool of survival on the frontier. She had never fired a gun in her life. She had only watched Thomas clean it, her hands trembling as she thought of the power it held. She seized the rifle, its cold weight feeling alien and terrifying in her hands. Eleanor watched her with a mixture of fear and confusion. The bandits outside began to hammer at the door, their blows of violent rhythm. "What are you doing, child?" Eleanor whimpered. Clara ignored her, her eyes fixed on the door. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was crystal clear. She had to project an image of strength. She had to make them believe she was a threat. "Go to the cellar, Eleanor," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "Now! I'll hold them off!" Eleanor hesitated, her frail body trembling. But you don't know how to—" "Go!" Clara's voice was a sharp command, a tone Eleanor had never heard from her before. It was the voice of a woman who had just found her spine. Eleanor, wide-eyed, obeyed, fumbling her way towards the trap-door that led to the small, dark cellar. The door splintered under the force of the blows. Clara raised the rifle, her arms straining to hold the weight steady. She aimed it at the middle of the door, her finger hovering over the trigger. She didn't know if she could pull it. She didn't know if she could kill a man, but she knew she couldn't let them in. She would have to bluff to make them think she was a crack shot. The leader, a man named Silas, saw her through the widening crack in the door. He smirked, his eyes cold and calculating. "A little dove with a rifle," he sneered. "Think you can scare us, little girl?" "This isn't your property," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll shoot the first man who steps inside." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't have the stomach for it. Put the gun down, and no one gets hurt." Clara took a deep breath, the scent of dust and fear filling her lungs. "I'm not a dove. I'm a wife, and this is my home. You won't take it from me." The words felt true. She had never felt a sense of belonging until she had this home. This place, with its quiet rhythms and its familiar comforts, was hers. It was a refuge from the mockery of the town, a place where she was seen for what she was, not for what she lacked. One of the bandits, a burly man with a thick beard, pushed past Silas, his eyes filled with a cruel confidence. "I'll take the little doll's rifle from her," he boasted, his hand reaching for the splintered door. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, picturing the faces of the people who had mocked her, who had dismissed her as insignificant. She wouldn't let them be right. She would prove them all wrong. She would be more than the plain bride. A single shot rang out, a deafening explosion that shattered the silence. The bullet, fired in a moment of sheer desperation, hit the doorframe with a splintering crack, missing the burly man by inches. He recoiled, his confidence shaken. The other bandits stopped, their faces no longer filled with sneering amusement, but with a flicker of respect. This woman was not a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. The shot, a solitary echo in the quiet vastness of the prairie, was a signal. It was a message to the bandits that this was not an easy target. Silas's smirk had vanished, replaced by a scowl of annoyance. "She's got a rifle," he growled. "This ain't worth the trouble. Let's find another place." But the burly man, humiliated by his near miss, was filled with a vengeful fury. "No, boss, I ain't letting some little girl get the best of me. We're going in." He took out a crowbar and began to pry at the door, the wood groaning in protest. Clara, her hands still trembling, was out of options. She had a single shot, and she had missed. She was trapped. But then a new sound cut through the air, the thundering of hooves from a different direction. It was a man on horseback, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was a familiar figure, a drifter who had passed through Harmony Creek on occasion. A man known only as Jake. He was a man with a haunted look in his eyes, a shadow of a smile that never quite reached them. Silas's men turned, their guns drawn, ready for a new fight. Jake reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met Clara's. She saw in them a flicker of recognition, a silent understanding. He had seen her in town, heard the whispers. He knew who she was. He also knew she was in trouble. "Seems you boys are bothering a lady," Jake said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Silas scoffed. "Mind your own business, drifter. This is our business." "When a man makes a woman his business, he's asking for trouble," Jake said, his hand slowly moving towards the holster at his hip. "And I'm the kind of trouble you don't want." He was outnumbered, 7-1, but there was a quiet confidence in his stance, a lethal grace that made the bandits hesitate. Silas was a brute, but he wasn't a fool. He had seen men like Jake before, men who moved like shadows, men who didn't back down from a fight. "This is none of your concern," Silas said again, his voice less confident this time. "She's a friend of mine," Jake lied, his eyes still locked on Clara's. "So that makes it my concern." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. A stranger was willing to risk his life for her. It was a simple lie, but it was a kindness she had not expected. The standoff was tense, the air thick with unspoken threats. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then a voice from the house broke the spell. "Clara, are you all right?" Eleanor's voice, frail and quavering, carried on the wind. Silas's eyes flickered from Jake to the house. He had a choice: risk a fight with an unknown gunslinger, or retreat. He looked at his men, at the uncertainty in their eyes. This was not the easy raid he had anticipated. "This ain't over," Silas spat at Jake, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "We'll be back." He and his men mounted their horses and rode away, their forms shrinking in the distance, leaving only a cloud of dust and the lingering scent of danger. Jake dismounted and walked to the door. "You can come out now," he said, his voice softer. "They're gone." Clara unbolted the door and stepped outside, the rifle still clutched in her hands. Eleanor, her face pale, was right behind her. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our lives." Jake shrugged, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Just a man passing by, glad I could help." He was about to mount his horse and ride away when Eleanor, her memory surprisingly sharp for a moment, spoke. "You're the man from the store, aren't you? The one who bought the blue ribbon for his sister?" Jake's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "You remember?" "I don't forget kindness," Eleanor said simply. Clara looked at him, a new question in her eyes. "Why did you say I was a friend of yours?" Jake looked at the ground, a rare blush coloring his cheeks. "I've heard the things they say about you in town. They're wrong. You're a lot more than the plain bride." "Oh, you're a brave woman." His words, simple and honest, were more valuable than any compliment she had ever received. They were a balm for the wounds of a lifetime of mockery. The incident with the bandits was a turning point. Jake, the mysterious drifter, was no longer a stranger, he was a friend. He stayed a few days, helping Clara with the repairs to the ranch, his movements economical and efficient. He was a man of action, not words. He mended the broken fence, patched the splintered door, and sharpened the tools with a quiet focus. Clara, in turn, found herself opening up to him. She told him about her life, about the weight of her family's debts, about the quiet desperation that had led her to her marriage with Thomas. She told him about the mockery of the town, the whispers that followed her everywhere. Jake listened, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't offer pity. He offered empathy. "People are afraid of what they don't understand," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars bloom in the twilight sky. "They see a woman who doesn't need to be seen, who doesn't care for their approval, and it scares them." "You're not afraid of me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his haunted face. "I've seen the kind of strength you have, Clara. It's the kind of strength that's worth more than all the gold in California." Their bond grew, a fragile flower in the harsh landscape of the prairie. It was not a romantic bond, not yet. It was a bond of respect, of shared understanding, of a deep-seated loneliness that found comfort in the other's presence. One afternoon, a rider approached the ranch. It was a young man, a boy no older than 17, his face pale with fear. Miss Clara?" he stammered, his eyes wide. "There's been an ambush. The bandits, they hit the Sterling cattle drive." Clara's blood ran cold. "Thomas?" she asked, her voice a strangled whisper. I don't know, miss," the boy said, his voice trembling. "They got Thomas's men. They took the herd. We heard Thomas rode ahead, but we haven't seen him since." The plain bride, the woman who was mocked and pitied, felt a wave of cold resolve wash over her. She was not a victim. She was a wife, and her husband was in danger. "Jake," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We need to go. We need to find him." Jake's eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a concern he couldn't hide. "Clara, it's dangerous. They're armed. They're a gang." "I know," she said, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "But he's my husband. He's my family, and I won't let them have him." Jake saw the same fire he had seen in her eyes the day of the raid. This was not a moment for caution. This was a moment for action. He nodded, a silent agreement. "Stay here, Eleanor," Clara said to her mother-in-law, who was watching them with a worried expression. "We'll be back." Eleanor, her mind clearer than usual, took Clara's hand. "Be safe, my dear," she said, her eyes filled with a new kind of love. "He's lucky to have you." The chase was a grueling affair. The sun beat down on them, a relentless hammer on an anvil of dust. Clara, a natural horsewoman, kept pace with Jake, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She thought of Thomas, the quiet man with the steady eyes, the man who had treated her with such quiet dignity. She had not loved him in the beginning, but she had grown to respect him, to care for him. He was a good man. He deserved to live. They followed the tracks of the stolen cattle, a long, winding trail of hooves and broken branches. They rode through canyons and over hills, their bodies aching, their resolve unwavering. They found Thomas's men tied up in a ravine, bruised but alive. They had been left for dead. The men told them what they knew. The bandits were heading north, towards the treacherous Devil's Canyon, a place where a man could get lost forever. Silas, one of the men spat, his voice filled with hatred. It was Silas and his boys. They ambushed us. They said Thomas was heading into the canyon to get water. Clara's heart sank. The canyon was a death trap. "We have to hurry," she said, urging her horse on. Jake was right behind her. He had seen the way she handled herself, the way she refused to give up. He saw the fire in her eyes, a reflection of her unwavering spirit. They found Thomas's horse, its reins broken, grazing on a patch of dry grass. There were footprints leading into the canyon, a lone man's struggle against the unforgiving terrain. "He's in there," Clara said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "We have to go in." Jake looked at the canyon, a labyrinth of shadows and treacherous cliffs. "Clara, it's too dangerous. We can't go in there without a plan. We'll be walking right into a trap." "We don't have time for a plan," she said, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the canyon. "He could be hurt. He could be—" She couldn't finish the thought. Jake nodded, a silent surrender. He knew he couldn't stop her. He had seen her heart, her fierce loyalty, and he knew it was stronger than any fear. They dismounted and began their treacherous journey into the canyon, their feet crunching on loose rocks, their bodies silhouetted against the dark shadows of the cliffs. They found him huddled in a small alcove, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, a crimson stain spreading across his trousers. He was weak, his face pale and drawn. He looked up at them, a look of surprise and gratitude in his eyes. "Clara?" "Jake, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We came to find you," Clara said, her voice thick with relief. She knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she examined his wound. "You're hurt." I fell," he said, wincing in pain. "The bandits, they were waiting for me. I managed to get away, but they got my horse." Clara and Jake worked together, a team forged in crisis. They used a piece of a torn shirt to makeshift a tourniquet, a piece of wood to fashion a splint. Thomas was in agony, his face a mask of pain, but he was alive. "The herd," he rasped, his eyes filled with a desperate sadness. "They're gone. Everything we worked for." "Don't worry about the herd, Thomas," Clara said, her voice filled with a fierce conviction. "We'll get you out of here first. That's all that matters." They were a slow, agonizing procession, Clara and Jake half carrying, half dragging Thomas out of the canyon. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the rocks. They were tired, thirsty, and on the edge of despair. And then they saw them. Silas and his gang, their horses laden with the stolen cattle, their faces grim with the weariness of a long drive. They were gathered by a watering hole at the mouth of the canyon, a place they thought no one would find them. "Look what we have here," Silas sneered, his eyes filled with a cruel triumph. "The plain bride and her 2 boyfriends. Looks like you found your husband, little dove." Clara's blood ran cold. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. Silas's men raised their rifles, a cold, metallic threat. "Hand over the cattle, Thomas," Silas commanded, his voice filled with a ruthless glee. "And maybe we let you all live." Thomas, weak from pain and exhaustion, looked at Clara. "The herd. It's all I have." "Don't be a fool, Thomas," Clara said, her voice filled with a fierce protectiveness. "Your life is worth more than any herd of cattle." She stepped forward, her body a shield for the 2 men behind her. She looked Silas in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "You can have the herd," she said, her voice a low, steady command. "Take the cattle and go. Leave us alone." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And what makes you think I'll listen to a woman? You're nothing. Just a plain girl in a plain dress." "Maybe so," Clara said, her voice filled with a new, quiet power. "But I'm the one standing between you and the men you want to kill, and you'll have to go through me first." Silas's smirk vanished. He saw the same defiance he had seen in her eyes the day she held the rifle. This was not a woman to be trifled with. "You're a fool," Silas growled. "Get out of my way." Clara stood her ground. "You have to shoot me first," she said, her voice filled with a profound and unwavering courage. "You'll have to shoot me first." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a testament to her newfound strength. She was no longer the plain bride. She was the protector, the guardian, the woman who would risk everything to save those she loved. Silas's hand hovered over his gun. He looked at her, at the raw, unvarnished courage in her eyes, and he hesitated. He was a bandit, a ruthless man of violence, but he was also a coward. He was afraid of a woman who was not afraid to die. The standoff was broken by a new sound, the thunder of hooves, not from one or two riders, but from a small army of them. It was the townsfolk of Harmony Creek, armed with their own rifles, led by a man on a horse, the portly storekeeper, his face no longer filled with a sneer, but with a look of grim determination. He rode to the front, his eyes filled with a shame he could no longer hide. "Silas," he called out, his voice shaking, "we heard what you did. We're not letting you get away with it." The people of Harmony Creek, the same people who had mocked Clara, were there for her. They had heard the news of the ambush and had come together, an unlikely alliance of farmers, shopkeepers and ranchers, to defend their own. Silas and his men, seeing that they were outnumbered and outgunned, knew their time was up. They mounted their horses and rode away, their faces etched with a defeated fury, leaving the stolen cattle behind. The people of Harmony Creek dismounted, their faces filled with a new kind of respect as they looked at Clara. The storekeeper, his hat in his hands, walked up to her. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice filled with a choked-up apology. "We were wrong about you. We're so sorry." Clara didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with tears of relief. The townsfolk helped them get Thomas back to the ranch, their hands gentle, their words filled with a newfound respect. They tended to Thomas's wounds, their shame and admiration evident in every gesture. Eleanor, her mind surprisingly clear, looked at Clara, then at Thomas, and then at the townsfolk who were helping them. "You're a hero, Clara," she said, her voice filled with a profound and unwavering love. "My son is lucky to have you." In the days that followed, the ranch became a beacon of community. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek, once a chorus of whispers and mockery, were now a symphony of support. They brought food, helped with the chores, and sat with Thomas, their conversations filled with a new kind of respect. Clara, the plain bride, was no longer invisible. She was the woman who had faced down a gang of bandits, the woman who had risked her life to save her husband. She was a hero, a symbol of a strength they had never seen before. Jake, the quiet drifter, stayed until Thomas was well enough to be on his own. One evening he stood on the porch, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I have to go, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The road is calling me." Clara's heart ached with a familiar pang of loneliness. She had grown to care for him, for the quiet strength he possessed, for the kindness he had shown her. "Thank you, Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that had transformed his face. "You taught me something, Clara," he said. "You taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by what they look like. It's measured by what they're willing to do." He rode away, a solitary figure against the vast expanse of the prairie, leaving behind a profound gratitude and a sense of a shared journey. Thomas, his leg mending, was a different man. He looked at Clara with a new depth of appreciation. He had seen her fierce courage, her unwavering loyalty. He had seen the woman she truly was, not the woman the town had whispered about. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Thomas took her hand in his. His touch was no longer brief and respectful. It was filled with a new kind of warmth, a profound and tender love. "Clara," he said, his voice filled with a raw emotion. "I was a fool. I married you for convenience, for a practical purpose, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." He looked into her eyes, the same quiet, steady eyes she had come to love. I love you, Clara. I love you for your strength, for your courage, for who you are. I want to be a real husband to you, if you'll let me." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had never expected to hear those words. She had never expected to feel a love that was not based on pity or obligation. She squeezed his hand. "I love you, Thomas," she said, her voice a choked-up whisper. "I love you." The sun rose on a new day, a new beginning. The town of Harmony Creek had changed, its judgment replaced by admiration. The whispers were gone, replaced by smiles and respectful nods. Clara, the plain bride, was no more. She was Mrs. Sterling, a hero, a woman of unyielding courage and profound love. She walked through the town, her head held high, a quiet confidence radiating from her. The people who had once mocked her now greeted her with a new kind of respect. The storekeeper, his face filled with genuine warmth, gave her a bag of flour on the house. The women who had giggled behind their hands now greeted her with smiles, their eyes filled with admiration. Clara was no longer defined by her plainness. She was defined by her heart, her strength, her courage. She had not only saved her husband, she had saved herself. She had shown the world, and more importantly herself, that true beauty was not in the eye of the beholder. It was in the unwavering heart of a woman who was willing to risk everything for those she loved. She had faced the bandits and cried, "You have to shoot me first." And in that moment she had become a legend, a testament to the power of a quiet courage, a profound love, and a spirit that was anything but plain.